The notary paused when he saw my face. Not because of the bruise. That was 4 days old by then, faded to a sick yellow-green at the edges. He paused because I was smiling, sitting across from my fiancé in a downtown Toronto law office, on a Wednesday afternoon, wearing a blazer I'd ironed that morning, and smiling like I had nowhere else in the world I'd rather be. My fiancé didn't notice. He was busy adjusting his watch. He always did that when he was about to win something. My name is Rowan Tessier. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Sudbury, moved to Toronto for my master's degree, and stayed because the city felt like possibility. I work in corporate communications. Or I did, before the year I'm about to tell you about dismantled everything I thought I understood about trust, about family, about what women are supposed to quietly accept. His name was Callum, and for 2 years and 4 months, I believed he was exactly what my mother said he was. Steady, reliable, the kind of man who shows up. She wasn't wrong about that last part. He showed up everywhere, just not always in the ways I expected. I met him at a mutual friend's cottage near Muskoka in late August. He'd brought expensive wine and told stories that made everyone lean in. He had that particular kind of confidence that reads as warmth until you've known someone long enough to understand the difference. I didn't know the difference yet. I was 38 days out of a bad breakup and approximately 3 glasses of rosé into a holiday weekend, and he looked at me across a fire pit like I was the only person there. Looking back, that should have been the first sign. Men like Callum look at you like that on purpose. The early months were genuinely good, or they felt genuine. He remembered the names of my colleagues. He drove 4 hours to Sudbury with me when my father had a health scare. He sent flowers to my office not on Valentine's Day, but on a random Tuesday in October, with a note that said just because. My mother met him at Thanksgiving and pulled me aside in the kitchen to say, quietly, that she'd been worried about me since the last one, but that this felt different. It did feel different. That's what I kept telling myself when things started to shift. The promotion came in March of the second year. I was made director of communications at my firm, 2 years earlier than they'd originally projected. It was the thing I'd been working towards since I was 26, grinding through late nights and weekend edits and every piece of feedback I was ever given. And when my manager called me into her office and told me, I sat in my car in the parking garage afterward and cried. Good crying, the kind where your whole body finally exhales. I called Callum first. The call went to voicemail. He texted 2 hours later. Congrats. Dinner tonight? At dinner, he ordered for both of us without asking. Then he said very gently that the new role sounded like a lot of travel. He asked if I'd thought about what that would mean. For us. He said the word us, the way some people say mine. I told myself he was processing, that it was an adjustment. That even good men sometimes feel threatened by the people they love succeeding, and the important thing was that he came around. He didn't come around, he dug in. The comment started small. You didn't have to take that call. Those aren't your people, Rowan. You're different when you've been at work all day. He had a way of framing control as concern that I now recognize immediately and couldn't see at all then. My mother liked him. My colleagues had met him at the Christmas party and found him charming. My best friend, who has known me since we were 14 and shared a locker in a Sudbury high school, had reservations she expressed once and then filed away, because she knew I wasn't ready to hear them. By the time he proposed, I had quietly stopped seeing most of the people who knew me before him. The proposal was at a restaurant in Yorkville. Beautiful table, champagne already poured, and he did it in front of everyone because he knew I would say yes under those conditions. Saying no in a room full of strangers watching felt impossible. He understood that about me, and he used it. I said yes. I meant it, mostly. I thought love was supposed to feel like work. The year of the engagement was the year I stopped recognizing myself in mirrors. Not literally, but there's a version of disappearing that has nothing to do with your reflection. I gave up the weekend boot camp I'd been going to since university because he said the schedule made me unavailable. I stopped having my friend over for our Thursday wine nights because he said she had a negative energy. I wore my hair differently, spoke more carefully in his presence, measured the volume of my own laugh. I thought I was growing, compromising, being a partner. 3 weeks before the wedding, he put a document on the kitchen table after dinner. It was a prenuptial amendment. The original had been reasonable, we'd both agreed. Both had independent lawyers review it, both signed. This was different. This version contained a clause that transferred my stake in a piece of commercial real estate I'd co-purchased with my father years earlier into a joint matrimonial asset, which under Ontario family law would then be subject to equalization. The property had appreciated significantly. The clause, buried on page 7, would have given Callum access to half that value upon any future division. I read it twice. Then I looked up and asked him to walk me through it. He said it was a formality. He said his financial advisor had flagged something about asset alignment for tax purposes. He said, in that voice he used when he wanted me to feel small for asking questions, "It's just paperwork, Rowan. Do you have to make everything a negotiation?" I didn't sign it that night. I said I needed time to review it. He took the document off the table, put it in his briefcase, and didn't speak to me for the rest of the evening. The silence was familiar by then. It was one of his primary tools. 4 days before the wedding, he came home, and the argument started over nothing. A dinner reservation I'd made without consulting him, which had apparently been on the same night as something he hadn't told me about. His voice went low. He stepped into my space the way he did when he wanted me to feel the size of him. I said something back. I don't even remember what it was. Something that must have landed because his hand moved before his face changed expression. And then I was sitting on the kitchen floor with my palm pressed against my cheekbone and the room making a sound like static. He left the room. He came back with a bag of frozen peas. He crouched down in front of me and held it gently to my face and said he was sorry. That it had never happened before. That I had pushed him past something and he'd reacted, but that it would never happen again. He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed. Then he stood up and said, "The wedding is in 4 days. This doesn't have to mean anything." I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time after he went upstairs. Here's what I want you to understand about the days that followed. I didn't stay because I was weak. I didn't stay because I didn't know what he'd done. I stayed, temporarily, because I needed time, and because I had a plan I needed to be inside the relationship to execute, and because the thing about women who have been slowly hollowed out by someone they loved is that they don't always cry. Sometimes they calculate. I called my friend that night from the bathroom, the tap running. She didn't say I told you so. She just said, "What do you need me to do?" What she did was drive to my building the next morning with 2 things: a coffee and the name of a forensic accountant she'd found through her brother's law firm, someone who specialized in tracing financial structures in family law disputes. She'd already made the call. The appointment was in 2 hours. I wore sunglasses to the meeting. The accountant, a very composed woman in her 50s who had clearly seen a great deal, reviewed everything I had. The original prenup, the amendment, screenshots of property documents. 3 months of emails Callum had copied me on related to something called Harwick Capital Partners, a numbered company I'd found on a statement that had accidentally arrived in my name. She asked me careful questions. She took notes. At the end of the meeting, she told me she'd need a few days. 2 days later, she called me back. Callum's family company, the one his father had built and that Callum now co-managed, was under a quiet review by the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario. The numbered company had been used to move money through shell entities, and there was a pending compliance issue tied to investment products that had been sold to clients under conditions that didn't meet disclosure requirements. It wasn't criminal yet. It was the kind of thing that gets quietly resolved or very loudly doesn't, depending on how the next few months went. What he needed was my father's property. Clean, unmortgaged, and attached to a name with no regulatory exposure. My name. The prenup amendment wasn't a tax formality. It was a rescue plan, and I had not signed it. I spent the day before the wedding doing something that probably looked, from the outside, like a woman in shock. I went to the venue to confirm the catering. I confirmed the florist. I responded to texts from Callum's mother about the morning schedule with exactly the warmth she expected. I picked up my dress from the tailor, where the seamstress said I looked like a bride, and I smiled and said I was almost there. What I was actually doing was preparing. My friend had helped me set up a secure backup on my phone months earlier. After the third or fourth time, Callum had scrolled through it without asking. It mirrored everything to a cloud account he didn't know existed. The kitchen argument from 4 days ago was there. 47 seconds of audio. His voice very calm in the first half, and then the sound, and then the silence. I forwarded the accountant's report to my own lawyer that evening. I forwarded the audio recording to her as well. We spoke for 40 minutes. She explained my options with the clarity of someone who had walked women through this before. Then she said, "You can file and leave quietly, or you can choose when and where." I chose where. The ceremony was at a restored heritage building in the distillery district. High ceilings, exposed brick, 112 guests. His side of the room was mostly business associates and extended family. Mine was smaller. My parents, my friend, a few colleagues, my cousin and his wife who'd flown in from Vancouver. I walked down the aisle in a dress I had chosen alone, without his input, after the original one he'd approved started to feel like a costume. My father held my arm. He knew, by then, what had been done to his property, and to his daughter, and the way he walked beside me was the closest he's ever come to crying in my presence without actually crying. The bruise had been covered as well as it could be. It wasn't invisible. A few people in the front rows noticed and looked away quickly, the way people do when they've decided not to be involved in something. Callum saw it when I reached the altar. He didn't flinch. He took my hands in his, and his grip was, as always, a little too firm, and he leaned slightly toward me and said very quietly, "Good girl," like I was something he'd broken in. The officiant began. The room settled. When we reached the vows, Callum's father shifted in his seat in the third row. A man named Harwick. I recognized him from company photos. Sat 2 seats down, whispering to his wife. The room smelled like eucalyptus and candle wax, and something underneath that I can only describe now as everyone performing the version of events they'd already agreed on. The officiant asked if anyone had cause to object. I let the silence sit for exactly 1 breath. Then I said, "Actually, before we continue, I need to say something." Callum's hands tightened. I gently withdrew mine. The room didn't gasp all at once. It did it in waves. The front rows first, then the middle, then the back as people craned to see what was happening. I turned slightly so the bruise caught the light from the tall windows. I didn't do it for drama. I did it because I needed everyone in that room to understand what they were looking at before I told them anything else. 4 days ago, I said, I fell. That's the story I was going to tell today. That's the story I was asked to tell. Callum stepped toward me. His voice dropped to something that was meant to sound measured. "Rowan, stop this. I have it on recording," I said, to the room, not to him. My friend, from the third row on my side, walked to the display screen near the entrance. We'd arranged this, quietly, 2 nights prior, and connected her laptop. The audio played clearly through the venue's sound system. His voice first, low and controlled, and then the impact, and then the silence, 47 seconds. It felt longer. The room felt like it had forgotten how to breathe. When it ended, I said, "I'm not going to marry him today. But before I leave, I want to explain why this wedding was arranged the way it was." I opened the folder I'd carried in my bouquet hand, tucked between the stems, which my florist had helped me manage without comment. Because she was that kind of professional, I didn't read the documents aloud. I didn't need to. I held up the prenup amendment, the page with the clause highlighted, and I explained it in plain language. What my father's property was worth, what the transfer would have meant, what Harwick Capital Partners was, and what the FSRA review involved, and what my name, clean, unburdened, was worth to them. He needed my assets to stabilize something he couldn't fix, I said. And when I hesitated to sign, he decided to remind me that I didn't have a choice. Harwick stood up, his chair scraped loudly. Callum's father had gone the color of old paper. He didn't stand. He seemed to have lost the ability. Callum himself said, loudly enough for the room, "She's having a breakdown. She's been under enormous stress." The word breakdown landed in the room and went nowhere. Nobody picked it up. I looked at him for what I think was the last time I will ever look at him, as someone who once knew my sleeping patterns, and which mug I preferred, and the name of the teacher who changed my life in grade 11. "I already contacted the FSRA this morning," I said. "Everything in this folder has been submitted to my lawyer and to the authorities. The wedding is over." I set the folder on the altar table. I picked up my flowers, and I walked toward the door. My mother, my actual mother, who had sat 3 rows back watching the man she'd approved of tightened into himself like a spring, stood up as I passed and reached out and took my hand. She didn't say anything. She just walked with me. My friend was already at the door. Outside, the distillery district was doing what it does on a Saturday morning in September. Cobblestones in the sun, tourists, the smell of coffee from the cafe on the corner. Normal. Aggressively, mercifully normal. I stood on the steps, and the dress was very white in the September light, and my cheek still ached, and I was aware of the sound of my own breathing, in a way I hadn't been in months. "You okay?" my friend asked. She'd been asking me this for 2 years, phrasing it that way, never pushing, always leaving the door open. I touched the edge of the bruise. "I will be." She nodded. She knew I meant it. The months after that were not a movie. There was no clean score playing while I rebuilt. There was paperwork and the reversal of shared accounts and a long conversation with my father about the property and what we'd almost lost, and a meeting with a victim services coordinator at a family violence court support center downtown who helped me understand what the recording meant legally and what my options were. Callum was not criminally charged in those first months. These things move slowly. But the FSRA matter moved faster than his lawyers anticipated. And by January, Harwick Capital Partners had entered a voluntary wind down. Callum resigned from the family firm, citing personal matters. His father stopped returning calls from half the board. I started going back to my boot camp on Saturday mornings. The instructor remembered me and didn't ask where I'd been, which was exactly the right instinct. My friend and I reinstated Thursday nights. My father and I went back to Muskoka in August and sat on a dock, and he said gruffly that he was proud of me, and I said I knew, and we watched the water and didn't need to say much else. I still live in Toronto. I still work in communications. I got a second promotion in February that I didn't call anyone about from a parking garage. I texted my friend and she sent back 11 exclamation marks and a voice note of herself actually yelling, which I've listened to at least 30 times. There are things I lost in that relationship that I'm still taking inventory of. Confidence that I thought was stable, but turned out to have been quietly replaced. Friendships I let lapse that I'm still slowly, awkwardly rebuilding. A version of myself that was easier and louder and didn't measure the space before she laughed. I'm finding her again. It's slower than I expected. Most true things are. What I know now, what I would have tattooed somewhere if I were that kind of person, is that control doesn't arrive wearing its own name. It arrives as protection, as steadiness. As a man who remembers what you ordered and shows up when it counts, until the day he decides that showing up and owning are the same thing. They are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. And the moment I understood that, standing on altar steps in a dress I'd chosen myself, with 47 seconds of audio and a forensic report, and my father's hand somewhere behind me in a room that had gone absolutely silent, that was the moment I stopped being manageable. I kept my name, Rowan Tessier. My parents gave it to me. No one else gets to retire it. If he expected a woman who would perform the ending he'd written, he should have chosen someone who hadn't spent 12 years learning how contracts work.